The lone rancher was just cleaning her wound, but his hand slipped where it should. The rancher lived on the edge of the plains, where the land stretched wide and empty, and the wind seemed to carry the voices of the past. His name was Thomas, and everyone in the nearby town knew him as a man who valued his independence above all else. He had built his ranch from the ground up, spending years breaking the soil, raising cattle, and learning every secret of the land. There were no fences strong enough to hold his stubborn spirit, and no person who could persuade him to change the way he lived. He liked it that way, and he told himself he preferred it that way. Every morning, before the sun had fully climbed the sky, Thomas was already awake. He would rise quietly, careful not to disturb the house that sometimes felt too empty for words. He prepared his own breakfast, a simple meal of eggs, bread, and strong coffee, and then he stepped outside. The plains greeted him like an old friend. The air smelled of earth and grass, with a faint tang of the livestock that wandered across his land. He could hear the soft lowing of cattle in the distance and the occasional call of a hawk circling overhead. It was peaceful, yes, but it was also lonely, though he would never admit it aloud. Thomas's life followed a careful rhythm. Each day he tended to the animals, repaired fences, checked on the crops, and kept the ranch running as if it were a living, breathing thing. He spoke to the horses as he groomed them, and sometimes to the cattle, almost as if his words could reach beyond the ordinary, into something larger than himself. Despite this connection to the land and animals, he kept people at a distance. Visitors were rare, and when they came, he smiled politely, answered questions, but never lingered in conversation. His avoidance was not out of dislike but habit. Years ago, Thomas had loved once, and the experience had ended in disappointment. That memory remained buried deep, and he was determined to protect himself from ever feeling that kind of pain again. The townspeople often whispered about him. They spoke of how proud and stubborn he was, of how he would reject any offer of friendship or more intimate attention. Some thought he was cold, others thought he was wise for avoiding the complications of emotional entanglement. Yet there were times when Thomas felt the weight of solitude pressing on him. At night, when the house was dark and quiet, he would sometimes walk outside and look at the horizon, imagining a life where he did not have to face the endless responsibilities of the ranch alone. But those thoughts were fleeting, chased away by the certainty that solitude was safer than trust. It was during one of those mornings, under a sky brushed with the soft light of dawn, that Thomas first noticed her. She appeared like a quiet shadow moving along the dirt road that led toward his property. She was not like the usual travelers or merchants who passed through town. There was something in the way she carried herself, a dignity and strength that seemed to come from enduring hardships. Her presence caught his attention, and for a moment he paused, unsure whether to continue with his work or simply watch. The woman was an Apache widow. She had recently arrived in the area, seeking to rebuild her life after losing her family and home to circumstances beyond her control. She moved with a careful grace, aware of the world around her, yet carrying the invisible weight of sorrow. When she reached Thomas's ranch, she stopped at the edge of his property, looking around with a mixture of caution and resolve. She needed supplies and perhaps a place to rest briefly, but she also wanted to understand the man who lived alone in these wide-open plains. Thomas noticed the way her eyes scanned the land, taking in every detail as if measuring its worth. He was curious, though he would not admit it. Pride and habit kept his demeanor reserved. He greeted her politely from a distance, keeping his voice steady but neutral. "Good morning," he said. "Can I help you with something?" The widow turned toward him and nodded, her expression calm but firm. "I need some provisions," she said. "Food, water, maybe a little help. I don't want to trouble anyone, but the road has been long." Her voice was soft, yet carried the confidence of someone used to facing challenges alone. Thomas studied her for a moment, considering whether he should offer more than the minimal help. His instincts told him to keep things formal, to keep her at arm's length. Yet something about her presence stirred a curiosity he hadn't felt in years. He walked toward the small supply shed, motioning for her to follow. "I have some basic supplies," he said. "You can take what you need, but I don't keep much." The widow followed silently, her steps careful on the worn dirt path. She observed the ranch with keen eyes, noticing the way the fences had been repaired, the patterns of the crops, and the well-kept stables. She understood hard work and resilience, and she respected it in others. As she reached the shed, Thomas opened the doors and began gathering what she had asked for. He found extra cans of food, a small bundle of blankets, and a few tools that might be useful for someone traveling alone. While he worked, she spoke, asking questions about the land, the cattle, and the weather. Thomas answered, his voice steady but measured. He was not used to conversation that lingered longer than necessary, yet he found himself noticing her presence in a way that felt unusual, not intrusive, not demanding, but quietly insistent. He wondered briefly how someone could remain so composed and yet carry such visible strength. By the time she had gathered her supplies, a subtle bond had begun to form, though neither would have called it that. There was a shared understanding of hard work, of challenges faced alone, and of the resilience it took to survive in a world that often seemed indifferent. Thomas handed her the bundle of items, and for the first time in many years he felt a flicker of curiosity about someone else's story, someone else's struggles. As she prepared to leave, she paused and looked back at him. "Thank you," she said simply. "I can see you know what it takes to live out here. I hope one day you will understand that not all company is trouble." Thomas nodded, unsure of how to respond. The words lingered in his mind long after she had walked away, stirring something he had carefully kept buried. He watched her disappear down the path, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a quiet shift within himself, a small but undeniable recognition that maybe, just maybe, there was more to life than solitude. He turned back to his ranch, the morning sun climbing higher, casting long shadows across the land. The routines awaited him as they always did, but something had changed. The plains felt a little less empty, and the wind seemed to carry a whisper of possibility. Thomas returned to his chores, his mind half on the work and half on the woman who had walked onto his land, a stranger, yet somehow significant. That day, he realized that life, with all its hardships and solitude, could sometimes hold unexpected moments of connection. And though he would not admit it to anyone, he felt the faintest stirrings of curiosity, of interest, and perhaps, in time, the possibility of something more. The next morning, the plains stretched under a pale gold sky, and Thomas moved through his daily routine with his usual precision. He checked the fences, fed the livestock, and repaired a section of the barn that had been weakened by the wind. Everything seemed ordinary as it always did, yet there was a quiet tension in the air that he could not explain. Even he did not fully understand it, but the memory of the widow's visit lingered. Her calm strength and quiet confidence stayed in his mind, like a song whose melody refused to fade. He tried to push the thought aside. He had no interest in companions, let alone strangers who wandered onto his land, but life had a way of challenging his carefully constructed boundaries. By mid-morning, a light dusting of smoke on the horizon signaled someone approaching the ranch. Thomas tensed and instinctively reached for the reins of his horse, preparing to meet a visitor. As the figure drew closer, his brow furrowed. It was her, the Apache widow. She carried a small bundle over her shoulder and walked with steady, deliberate steps, her eyes scanning the surroundings as if calculating the safest path. Thomas met her at the gate, his expression neutral but alert. "You're back," he said simply, keeping his voice controlled. "I wasn't expecting another visitor so soon." She smiled faintly, a gesture that held both warmth and determination. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said. I have some questions about the land and maybe a little more help with supplies. The road is longer than I thought." Thomas studied her carefully. There was nothing threatening about her, only a quiet determination and respect that was unusual in strangers. Still, he was cautious. "Supplies I can give you," he said, his voice firm. "Questions I can answer some, but I run a busy ranch." "You'll have to keep your visit brief." She nodded, understanding the limits without complaint. "I don't want to take up much of your time," she said. "I just need to understand a few things about surviving out here. The land is beautiful, but it is not forgiving." Reluctantly, Thomas gestured for her to follow him toward the barn and the stable. As they walked, she asked questions about the animals, the fences, and the soil. She listened intently as he explained his routines, the way he trained his horses, the best times to move the cattle, and the seasonal rhythms of planting and harvesting. Her curiosity was genuine, and he found himself answering in greater detail than he usually would. There was a quiet pleasure in having someone who truly wanted to understand, rather than just ask idle questions. The widow's attention was not just on the land. She observed Thomas as he worked, noticing the careful way he handled the animals, the methodical precision with which he repaired the fences, and the subtle signs of strain from years of hard labor. Her gaze was respectful but unflinching, and Thomas felt a subtle unease. He was not used to anyone paying such careful attention to him personally. Most people either ignored him or judged him superficially. Her presence was different. It felt honest, and it felt demanding in a gentle way. At one point, as Thomas reached for a tool to fix a loose board, he noticed the widow watching him closely. "You know a lot about this land," she said quietly. "It takes skill and patience to survive out here." Thomas hesitated, unsure how much to reveal about himself. "It's not easy," he said. "It takes years to learn the land's rhythms. Mistakes can be costly." She nodded, her eyes steady. "I know about mistakes. I've made my share, and I've seen what can happen when you trust too easily or not enough." Her words were simple, yet they carried weight. Thomas felt a flicker of recognition. She spoke from experience, and he sensed that her words were not just about the land, but about life itself. There was an awkward pause. Neither moved to fill it, and yet the silence was not uncomfortable. It was a quiet acknowledgement of two people meeting under unusual circumstances, both aware of their differences and similarities. Thomas felt the subtle tension building, a mixture of curiosity, caution, and an unspoken question of whether he could allow someone into his carefully guarded world. As the morning sun climbed higher, the widow offered to help him with some chores. Thomas was initially reluctant, unwilling to risk someone unfamiliar near his animals or tools. But she insisted politely, her presence calm and confident, and he finally agreed. She fetched buckets, carried supplies, and even helped mend a section of the fence under his careful instructions. Her hands were steady, her movements precise, and Thomas found himself noticing how naturally she adapted to the work. During a brief break, Thomas handed her some water from a canteen. Their hands brushed slightly, and both felt the faintest jolt of surprise. Thomas pulled back quickly, his pride and habit urging him to maintain distance, but the widow's calm gaze reminded him that accidents happen and intentions matter more than awkward moments. She smiled gently, without embarrassment or judgment, and the tension eased. Thomas realized that her presence did not seek to intrude, but simply to share the work and the space. They continued working side by side, and Thomas found himself talking more than usual. He shared small stories about the ranch, the time a storm washed away part of the fence, the mischievous antics of a young calf, and the challenges of living so far from town. She listened intently, asking questions that showed understanding and empathy rather than idle curiosity. For the first time in many years, Thomas felt a sense of connection. Not friendship exactly, not yet, but a quiet recognition that he was not entirely alone in the world. By midday, the chores were finished, and the widow gathered her belongings to leave. She paused at the gate, looking back at him with a mixture of respect and quiet challenge. "Thank you for letting me help," she said. "You are stronger than you realize, and yet there is room for more than this solitude. You just have to allow it." Thomas nodded, unsure how to respond. Her words were not criticism, but a gentle observation that he could not ignore. He watched her walk down the path toward the town, her figure calm yet determined, and he felt an unfamiliar stir in his chest. It was curiosity, yes, but also something deeper. A hint that perhaps life could hold moments of companionship even for someone as solitary as him. The rest of the day passed quietly. Thomas returned to his routines, yet his mind wandered back to the widow, her steady hands, her observant eyes, and the way she had managed to enter his space without forcing her presence. He realized that he had spent so long building walls around himself that he had forgotten how it felt to allow another person near, even in small ways. As the sun set, casting golden light across the plains, Thomas stood on the porch of his house, looking out over the land he had worked so hard to claim. The evening wind carried the distant sounds of the town, and somewhere beyond the horizon, he knew the widow was making her way back to her own life. Yet he felt a subtle shift in himself, a quiet opening, a recognition that the world could hold more than solitude if he allowed it. That night, Thomas went to bed with a strange sense of anticipation. It was not longing exactly, but a mixture of curiosity and awareness. The widow had shown him a small glimpse of life beyond the routines, a reminder that connection, trust, and understanding were possible even in unexpected circumstances. And though he would not admit it, not even to himself, he found himself looking forward to the next encounter, wondering what lessons and challenges the woman might bring, and whether he was ready to face them. The next few days passed in the usual rhythm of ranch life, but something had changed. Thomas moved through his routines with the same efficiency, feeding the cattle, checking fences, and repairing tools, yet he felt the faintest tension in the air, a reminder of the widow's visit. He could not stop thinking about her presence, her quiet strength, and the way she had walked through his space without demanding it. Though he would never admit it aloud, he found himself curious about her and her life, wondering how someone who had suffered so much could carry herself with such dignity. The widow returned a few days later, as if drawn by her own sense of purpose. She carried a small bundle of supplies and approached the ranch without hesitation. Thomas was already in the barn, mending a fence that had been damaged by the wind. When he saw her walking toward him, he straightened instinctively, a mixture of caution and surprise tightening his chest. "You're back," he said, keeping his voice firm. "I wasn't expecting another visit so soon." She smiled faintly, a gesture that seemed both confident and patient. "I thought I could offer some help," she said. "The work here is hard, and perhaps two people can make it easier." Thomas hesitated. He had never allowed anyone to work closely with him before, especially not someone he barely knew. Yet her offer was not demanding. It was quiet, practical, and sincere. With a slow nod, he said, "All right, but follow my instructions carefully. I don't want accidents." Together, they began inspecting the fences along the eastern boundary, where the recent storm had caused the most damage. The land stretched endlessly, and the damaged fence was a clear challenge. Thomas handed her a hammer and nails, demonstrating how to reinforce the posts. The widow listened carefully, her hands steady, repeating the steps exactly as he instructed. Her determination and skill impressed him, even though he refused to show it openly. As they worked, a young calf wandered too close to a weakened section of the fence. It sniffed the ground nervously, unsure of the unstable wood. The widow quickly stepped forward, guiding it back to safety, and Thomas felt a surge of gratitude. "Good," he said, his voice calm but approving. "You handled that well." She glanced at him with a small smile, not boastful, only acknowledging the recognition. "It's instinct," she said softly. "You learn quickly when life depends on it." The afternoon sun climbed higher and the heat pressed down on them. Dust rose from the ground as they hammered and tied sections of the fence. Despite the hard work, a quiet rhythm developed between them. Words were exchanged not as idle chatter, but as communication born of necessity and shared effort. Thomas found himself explaining the behavior of the cattle, the signs of trouble in the soil, and the timing for moving the herds. She absorbed every detail, asking questions that were thoughtful and intelligent, showing not only curiosity but respect for his expertise. At one point, Thomas reached for a tool in a corner of the barn, and his hand brushed against hers. Both paused for a brief second, startled by the contact. Thomas stepped back quickly, as if the sudden awareness of her proximity had caught him off guard. The widow simply smiled, calm and untroubled, and returned to her work. There was no embarrassment, no judgment, only a quiet understanding that accidents happen and that intentions matter more than awkward moments. By mid-afternoon, they had made significant progress on the fence, but another challenge awaited. A section of the pasture had been damaged by the storm, and several cattle had broken through during the night. They were scattered across the open land, some close to a nearby creek. Thomas motioned for the widow to follow him as he led the effort to round up the animals. Her presence was invaluable. She moved with confidence and care, guiding the cattle with gentle but firm gestures. As they worked together, Thomas began to notice qualities in her that he had long forgotten existed in others. She was patient yet decisive, quiet but observant, and capable of facing challenges without complaint. Her resilience and strength were not loud or boastful. They were evident in every careful movement and in the way she carried herself. He found himself admiring her skills, her courage, and her ability to adapt to a difficult situation with calm determination. During a brief pause to rest by the creek, Thomas handed her some water. She took it gratefully, and they sat in silence, watching the cattle graze and the wind ripple through the tall grass. The quiet moments allowed an unspoken connection to grow, one built on shared effort and mutual respect rather than words alone. Thomas realized that, for the first time in years, he felt a sense of partnership, a collaboration that went beyond work to something more profound, even if he could not yet name it. The sun began to lower, casting long shadows across the plains. The fence was repaired, the cattle rounded up, and the ranch was once again secure. The widow gathered her things, preparing to leave. She turned to Thomas with a thoughtful expression. "You run a remarkable ranch," she said. "And you manage it alone. I can see why you keep to yourself, but there is no shame in letting someone help." Thomas nodded, feeling the truth in her words, even if he was not ready to admit it aloud. "Help is useful," he said simply. "But I've managed this long enough to know how to handle most things myself." She smiled, a quiet understanding in her eyes. "I know," she said, "but even the strongest of us can benefit from company. Life is harder alone and sometimes lighter with others." As she walked away toward the town, Thomas felt a strange mixture of admiration and unease. Her words lingered, challenging the boundaries he had built around himself. He realized that he was beginning to trust her, not fully, not yet, but enough to consider the possibility of allowing someone near. It was a new and unsettling feeling, one he had not encountered in years. That evening, Thomas worked on the barn alone, but his thoughts kept returning to the widow. He remembered her steady hands, her calm determination, and the way she had moved through the tasks without hesitation or complaint. For the first time in a long while, he wondered what it might be like to have another person share the burdens of the ranch, to face challenges side by side rather than alone. Sleep came fitfully that night. Thomas dreamed of the plains filled with movement, of cattle and storms, of hands working together to mend fences and guide the herds. And in the dreams, the widow was there, not as a stranger, but as someone who shared his work, his responsibilities, and perhaps, in time, his life. The next morning, the plains greeted him with the familiar rhythm of chores and cattle. Yet the memory of their shared labor lingered, reminding him that life could hold unexpected allies and that trust, once extended carefully, could bring strength rather than weakness. He felt a subtle but undeniable change within himself, a recognition that even a man who had rejected companionship for years could begin to see the value in connection, respect, and shared struggle. And so, the ranch continued under the bright sun and open skies, with the widow's presence leaving an indelible mark on Thomas's life. It was a mark of possibility, a quiet reminder that life could be more than solitude, and that the bonds formed through shared hardship could open the heart in ways that words alone never could. The sun rose slowly over the plains, painting the land in shades of gold and amber. Thomas moved through his morning chores as usual, checking the fences, feeding the cattle, and inspecting the crops for any damage. Yet, something felt different. He could not shake the memory of the widow's steady presence and her calm words about trust and companionship. It was not an unpleasant memory, but it unsettled him in a way he did not fully understand. The thought that someone could see beyond his solitary exterior both intrigued and unnerved him. By mid-morning, the familiar sound of footsteps on the dirt path reached his ears. He looked up, expecting perhaps a neighbor or a passing traveler, and instead saw the widow walking toward him with a purpose in her step. She carried herself with the same quiet strength and dignity as before, but there was something different in her expression, determination, perhaps, or a question she had resolved to ask. Thomas straightened instinctively, his chest tightening. "I thought I'd return," she said simply, her eyes meeting his with a calm intensity. "I want to talk." Thomas frowned slightly, unsure how to respond. He rarely engaged in conversations that went beyond practical matters, and he had no idea what she might say. "Talk about what?" he asked cautiously, keeping his voice neutral. She stepped closer, unhurried and confident. "About you," she said plainly. "About why you keep everyone at a distance, why you refuse to let anyone near, even when life can be so hard alone." Thomas's brow furrowed. He was not used to being confronted, certainly not by someone who was practically a stranger. He opened his mouth to protest, but she continued without pause. "I have seen the way you work, the way you care for this land, and the way you handle the animals," she said. "I respect your strength, but I also see the walls you've built around yourself. I see how you guard your heart, even from kindness and friendship." Her words were calm, but they struck deep. Thomas felt a twinge of discomfort, a mix of anger and shame. He had spent years protecting himself from disappointment, from loss, and from the pain of trusting others. Yet her observation was accurate, undeniable, and it unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. "I don't need anyone else," he said finally, his voice low but firm. "I manage my land, my animals, my life. I have survived this way for years, and I see no reason to change." She shook her head gently, a hint of sadness in her eyes. "Surviving is not the same as living," she replied. "You are strong, yes, but strength does not mean rejecting all connection. Even the strongest people need help, companionship, and someone who understands them. You may not realize it, but you are missing something essential." Thomas turned away, staring across the plains as if seeking answers in the horizon. He wanted to resist, to dismiss her words, but they lingered in his mind like seeds planted in fertile soil. For the first time, he felt the weight of his isolation, the truth that years of solitude had left him with a quiet emptiness that work and routine alone could not fill. The widow took a step closer, her tone softening but remaining firm. "I am not asking you to change overnight or to open your heart without caution. I am only asking you to consider the possibility that life can be richer when shared, that allowing someone near does not make you weak, but human." Thomas clenched his fists, not out of anger at her but at the truth of her words. He had spent so long convincing himself that solitude was safer, that connection was a risk not worth taking. Yet he could not deny the sense of longing that her words stirred, a longing for trust, understanding, and the quiet companionship he had avoided for so many years. "I don't know if I can," he admitted quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "I don't know if I can let anyone in again. It's easier to stay alone." She nodded, acknowledging his struggle. "I understand," she said gently, "but easier does not always mean better. Life may be hard, but it is also fuller when shared. I have faced loss, hardship, and pain, and I know how it feels to protect your heart. But I also know the strength that comes from trusting, from allowing someone to stand beside you, even for a moment." Her words stirred memories in Thomas, memories he had buried, of a time when he had allowed himself to care for someone and had suffered because of it. The pain had hardened him, convincing him that solitude was the only safe path. Yet listening to her, he realized that the pain of rejection and loss was not the only lesson life could teach. There was also the lesson of resilience, of connection, and of the quiet joy that could come from trust. They stood together in silence for a moment, the wind rustling through the grass and the cattle grazing nearby. The plains were vast and open, but in that quiet space, Thomas felt a shift within himself, a recognition that he was not as invulnerable as he had believed, and that perhaps, just perhaps, it was time to reconsider the walls he had built around his heart. The widow took a small step closer, her gaze steady. "I am not asking for promises," she said softly. "I am only asking for honesty. Be honest with yourself about what you need, about what you want, and about what you are willing to risk. That is the first step toward something better." Thomas swallowed, feeling the weight of her words. He realized that she was right. He had avoided honesty with himself for far too long. He had told himself that solitude was strength, but in truth, it had become a shield, hiding both his fears and his desire for connection. He had lived too long avoiding vulnerability, and the widow's words forced him to confront the reality he had long ignored. I will think about it," he said finally, his voice quiet but sincere. "I can't promise anything, but I will consider what you've said." The widow nodded, a faint smile crossing her face. "That is all I ask," she said. Sometimes the smallest steps lead to the most meaningful changes. You do not have to be ready today, but being willing to think about it is a start. As she turned to leave, Thomas felt an unfamiliar sensation, a mixture of hope, curiosity, and a tentative openness. He watched her walk down the path toward the town, her figure steady and composed, and he realized that the encounter had changed something within him. It was not a complete transformation, but it was the beginning of a shift, a crack in the walls he had so carefully constructed around his heart. That night, Thomas worked late in the barn, repairing tools and preparing the feed for the next day. Yet his thoughts kept returning to the widow's words, her calm insistence, and the quiet wisdom she had shared. He realized that he had spent years protecting himself from disappointment, but in doing so, he had also shut out the possibility of connection, understanding, and even hope. As he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, he reflected on the confrontation. It had been uncomfortable, challenging, and yet necessary. He recognized that the widow's words were not an intrusion but a mirror reflecting truths he had long avoided. And though he was not ready to fully embrace them, he felt a subtle change stirring within, a willingness to consider trust, to acknowledge vulnerability, and perhaps to open his heart, even just a little. In the quiet of the plains, Thomas understood that life was more than work, routine, and survival. It was also about connection, courage, and the willingness to face one's own fears. The widow had given him a gift, not by changing him, but by challenging him to see beyond the walls he had built. And in that challenge, he found the first glimmer of hope that his life, which had long the plains were quiet that morning, the kind of quiet that carried both calm and expectation. Thomas moved through his ranch work with a steady rhythm, feeding the cattle, inspecting the fences, and checking the water troughs. Yet, for the first time in many years, he did not feel entirely alone. The widow's presence, though not physically at his side yet, lingered in his thoughts like a gentle echo. He found himself considering her words from their last encounter about trust, vulnerability, and the value of connection. By mid-morning, the sound of footsteps approaching the ranch caught his attention. He looked up and saw the widow walking along the path, carrying a small bundle of tools and supplies. There was no hesitation in her step, only purpose. Thomas felt a mix of anticipation and unease. He had spent so long avoiding companionship that the idea of allowing someone near felt both strange and exhilarating. "Good morning," she said, her voice calm and steady, yet carrying a warmth that was almost comforting. "I thought I could help with some chores today. Perhaps we can make the work lighter together." Thomas nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "All right," he said, "follow my lead and we'll see how much we can get done." The morning work began with simple tasks: feeding the horses, checking the fence lines, and repairing some broken posts along the pasture. As they worked, Thomas noticed the way the widow moved, confident and efficient, her hands steady and precise. She did not need to be told twice how to handle the animals, and her understanding of the land and the routines impressed him. Yet more than her skill, it was her presence that affected him. She was patient, observant, and calm, and he realized that the quiet companionship he had long avoided was, in fact, comforting. As they repaired a section of fence together, Thomas handed her a hammer, and their hands brushed lightly. This time, neither of them pulled away. Instead, they exchanged a glance, an acknowledgement of the small trust that had begun to form between them. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet it was a step toward connection that Thomas had not believed possible for him. They paused for a break under the shade of a large oak tree near the barn. Thomas offered her some water and bread, and she accepted with a small smile. "You work hard," she said softly. "It is no wonder you keep to yourself. But there is a strength in sharing burdens as well as bearing them alone." Thomas leaned back against the tree trunk, watching the plains stretch endlessly before him. "I've always believed solitude keeps you safe," he said quietly. "It protects you from loss, disappointment, from people who might hurt you." She sat down beside him, her presence calm but unwavering. "Solitude may protect you," she replied, "but it also keeps you from living fully. You may avoid pain, but you also avoid joy, trust, and the simple comfort of companionship. You don't have to let everyone in, but opening your heart, even a little, can make life richer." Thomas considered her words. He had spent years building walls around himself, convincing himself that independence was strength. But now, sitting beside her, he began to see that the walls had also kept out hope, kindness, and understanding. He realized that trust, while risky, could also bring strength, a strength he had never known while standing alone. The day continued with more work. They moved to the pasture to mend a section of fence that had been damaged by the storm. The work was hard, requiring both strength and coordination. Thomas and the widow worked side by side, passing tools, lifting posts, and driving stakes into the ground. There was a rhythm to their movements, a silent communication that had grown over the past days. Words were exchanged sparingly, but each gesture, each glance, reinforced the growing bond between them. At one point, a young colt became startled by a sudden movement and bolted toward the fence. The widow acted quickly, guiding the animal back to safety with calm authority. Thomas watched her, a surge of admiration filling him. "You handled that well," he said, his voice warm with genuine respect. She smiled softly. "Experience teaches you to stay calm," she replied. "Rushing or panicking only makes things worse. It's the same with life." Her words struck him more deeply than he expected. Life, indeed, had often felt like a series of sudden challenges, some of which he had faced alone. But here, in her presence, he realized that sharing the burden made it easier to navigate, and perhaps even allowed him to enjoy the process rather than merely endure it. By late afternoon, the sun had climbed high and then started its descent, casting long shadows across the plains. The fence was repaired, the animals secured, and the ranch was in better shape than it had been for weeks. Thomas and the widow sat for a moment, catching their breath and enjoying the quiet of the land. There was a softness to this moment, a peacefulness that neither had expected. "You've done well today," Thomas said finally, his voice carrying a warmth that had been absent for years. "I appreciate your help, more than I can easily say." She looked at him, her eyes meeting his with gentle understanding. "I know," she replied. "And you don't have to say more. Actions often speak louder than words, and you've shown that you are capable of more than solitude." Thomas felt a quiet shift within himself. He realized that he had been resisting connection for too long, but now he was beginning to understand its value. Trusting someone did not make him weak, it made him human. And as he looked at the widow, he understood that the companionship she offered was not just help with chores or advice. It was a chance to share life's burdens and joys, to experience the world alongside someone who respected and understood him. As evening approached, Thomas invited her to stay for a simple meal. They cooked over a small fire outside the house, sharing bread, stew, and fresh water. The conversation was easy, flowing naturally from one topic to another. She shared stories of her past, her losses, and her hopes for the future, while Thomas shared memories of the ranch, the challenges he had faced, and the lessons he had learned over the years. There was no pressure, no expectation, only mutual respect and a growing sense of connection. After the meal, they sat quietly under the stars, the plains stretching endlessly before them. The night air was cool, carrying the soft sounds of nocturnal wildlife and the distant lowing of cattle. Thomas realized that he felt a warmth he had not known for years, not just from the fire, but from the presence of someone who understood him, who respected his boundaries, and who had shown him that companionship could be gentle, supportive, and real. "You've changed," she said softly, breaking the silence. "Not in who you are, but in what you are willing to allow yourself to feel. That is the beginning of something meaningful." Thomas nodded, his heart quietly acknowledging the truth in her words. "I think I am beginning to understand," he said, his voice calm but sincere. "It's not easy, but I see that there is strength in allowing someone near, strength and hope." For the first time in many years, Thomas felt the emptiness of solitude lessen. The walls he had built around his heart were not gone, but cracks had formed, enough for light to seep through. He realized that life did not have to be endured alone, that companionship could bring resilience, joy, and a sense of fulfillment he had long forgotten. As the night deepened, the widow prepared to leave. She stood, gathering her small bundle of supplies, and looked at him with a gentle smile. "Take your time," she said. "There is no rush, but know that the offer of trust, friendship, and understanding remains." Thomas watched her walk away down the dirt path, her figure calm and purposeful. And as he turned back to his ranch, he felt a quiet hope blossoming within him. The plains were still wide and empty, but they no longer felt lonely. He had begun to understand that life, even in its challenges and hardships, could be shared. In the days and weeks that followed, the widow continued to visit, sometimes helping with chores, sometimes simply sharing conversation. Each encounter strengthened the bond between them, and Thomas felt himself opening more and more. Not fully, not instantly, but gradually, as one does when trust is earned and respect is mutual. He discovered that life with another person could be richer, fuller, and more meaningful than he had imagined. The widow had not come to change him forcibly, but to show him that connection, kindness, and trust were possible, even for someone who had long rejected love. And in that revelation, Thomas found a quiet joy, a new purpose, and the first real understanding of what it meant to allow another person into his life. The ranch continued to thrive under their combined efforts, and Thomas realized that the work he had always done alone was now shared, and that sharing it made even the hardest tasks feel lighter. He felt gratitude, not just for the help she provided, but for the lessons she had taught him about courage, vulnerability, and the quiet strength of human connection. And so, under the endless sky of the plains, Thomas and the widow formed a partnership that was built not on force or expectation, but on mutual respect, understanding, and trust. The ranch was no longer just a place of work. It had become a place of life, growth, and hope. And Thomas, who had once rejected love and companionship, finally understood that opening his heart was not weakness, but the greatest strength of all.